that's really helpful. So just again, a very warm welcome to this session. So as you can see on the slide, this is session 5, and it's the final session of this series. The series in its entirety has focused on the early foundations of counting. Tonight's session, we're going to look at beyond counting, and it will be a bit of a light touch on quite a few aspects of counting. We hope the sun is shining where you are, and we are delighted that the numbers are high again tonight. Yvonne and I were discussing this earlier, and it's always a bit of a risk finding the right time in terms of when to put on the final session, because we can hardly believe ourselves that we're in May, at the end of May, and we're almost at the end of what has been another challenging term. But despite all of that, our numbers are still quite high, and it's an absolute delight to welcome all of you to this session. So these are the aims of what we're kind of covering, or what we hope to cover tonight. Essentially what we want to do tonight is look at some of the aspects in relation to counting that we've not quite covered yet. And as always, we're keen for you to ask questions and to share comments and to work together so that this can really be a valuable learning experience for us, but also for you. So tonight we're going to look at what is beyond counting, and again hopefully we'll just do a wee bit of a taster of each of these. We're also going to share with you toward the end of the session an evaluation. We'll talk a bit about that later on, because that will really help Yvonne and I over the summer plan what this might look like in terms of a follow-up session. So hopefully that's what we're going to cover tonight. However, before we get started, we thought it might be quite a nice one to get us thinking. What is the funniest thing a child has said or done? And I'm going to pause for just a minute or two for you to put some of them in the chat, and we can share those with you when you've had a chance to type them into the chat. So this will be evidence of how well you can use the chat function. So it's over to you. Yes, Mrs. Jameson, you should be able to see the slides. So again, just as I was saying, maybe if you leave the presentation and try to rejoin it, sometimes that works, but the slides are definitely showing, at least I hope they're showing, because I can see them. And I think they must be because other people are commenting in the chat, so I'm hoping that means that they're looking at the slides as well as listening to me. Thank you. If you want to try that, Mrs. Jameson, that would be helpful. How do fairies do the toilet? Amazing. Well, these are great. Maybe some of these can't be published. Maybe that's the reason, because we know we could probably write a book about some of the things that children say to us. Sometimes they have no filter, and that's a good thing sometimes, but yes, sometimes children have no filter. Sometimes they can be brutally honest as well, whether we like it or not, because young children in particular are literal thinkers. But we know as their vocabulary and their experiences grow and develop, their understanding of kind of nuances develop too. Oh, a child thought I went to heaven yesterday because I was out the room. And actually, when I think back to two of those things in the chat, I remember a primary 2 child saying to me, when his grandma or when somebody goes to heaven, how will they know where the toilets are? And I thought, you know, it's just through the mouth of babes. We don't really think of these things, but actually a lot of these questions we don't always know the answer to, and that's okay. Yeah. And again, from our experiences, we know that children think about things in very, very different ways to us adults. And some of them, these differences are delightful, because we know children haven't been around that long. They see the world as full of exciting adventures and discoveries, that most of them do. We also know, however, at times that children can really baffle us in terms of the way they look at things and some of the things they say. And we need to work quite hard at times to fully understand what they're saying and what their perspective is. It's also true that children naturally learn things by observing their environment and everything that happens around them. So again, although this was quite light touch tonight, it's really proving that point that it's our role to provide those stimulating and enabling environments and experiences to allow the children to question and deepen their understanding and develop. So I love that one there about the fact that they thought you lived in the nursery. I've had that too when I mentioned years and years ago something about X Factor, and children were like, what, you have a television and you actually watch the television and you've got a house, and it just went from one sort of ridiculous statement to the other, which was great. So yes, I'm loving these, so keep them coming, and hopefully they'll give us a bit of a laugh or two as we go through tonight's session. So that's great. Thank you, everyone. So we have provided, again, if you've been coming to each of the sessions, you'll know that at the end of each session, we provide a takeaway task. And we hope they've been useful. Certainly the feedback that I've had as I've been engaging with people across the local authorities that I support, they've found them really useful in terms of allowing that space and time to reflect on maybe one particular aspect of what Yvonne and I are discussing. And sometimes that is that they just reflect on it on their own. And other times they go away and have conversations, and it sparks that professional dialogue with others across their team or in their wider context in terms of parents or their wider stakeholders. Again, it's great when I've been working with people that they've been talking about these takeaway tasks and they've been saying, we've been sharing these, Maria, at some of our collegiate or our inset training days, and we've used some of them for discussion prompts to consider certain aspects of our own spaces and environments, and we thinking about where the strengths lie and how do we know that how can we evidence those strengths, and where might an area of focus be. So they've actually been used in a really effective way in terms of that professional dialogue, which has been amazing. So again, I'm going to stop, but what I want you to think about, and again, if you can post them in the chat, that would be amazing. Did anyone notice anything? And we talk about that noticing and wondering all the time. So did you notice anything when observing children counting, and you would like to share that with us? The last session was on counting collections in particular. So again, you might want to share with us what collections you have that encourage those counting aspects of counting, and what prompts or tools that you might have that can help aid the counting process. What do you have, and how are they used effectively to support the counting processes? So again, I'll pause just to allow you time to think about that, and time for you to type some responses into the chat. And it's also okay if you've not had time to fully engage with these takeaway tasks too, because you've got them available now on the Padlet, which I'll talk to you on the next slide about. So don't worry if you've not fully engaged, because Yvonne and I are fully understanding that this is an exceptionally busy time. It always is a very busy time. So again, if you've not engaged with it fully, is there an aspect of the last session that you're keen to develop further? It's maybe sparked a bit of an interest. Just pop some comments into the chat pane, and again, we can add them to the wider Padlet so that everyone can see and learn from them. Okay, we'll maybe just move on, but please feel free to come in at any point just to say aspects of it that you would find, interesting, or whether on a more general basis that you found the takeaway tasks quite useful. That would give Yvonne and I an early indication of whether that type of thing is useful and whether we might want to include them into any future sessions that we plan. So again, even if you just want to say yes, they've been useful, or no, they've not, then that's also okay. I think we'll move on just now, and just go through the Padlet, which I'm hoping most of you know about by now. So again, if you've been coming to the sessions that we've planned in the past, you'll know that we have tried to make it easy for people by pulling everything together into a Padlet. And again, feedback that I've received, and I think Yvonne's the same, is that these have been really useful because without a Padlet or something similar, people are having to look in various different places to find the presentation or the recording or the relevant links that we've suggested. So this Padlet pulls everything together. We will add to it as we work through the remainder of tonight's session. I've posted a link there into the chat, so hopefully that will take you to the Padlet. And again, we're hoping again that this has been useful. Your feedback on that would also be useful in terms of whether you found that quite useful. And we'll post the link again towards the end, just in case anybody has missed it. And again, a few people saying in the chat there that they've overlooked at some of the tasks. Absolutely understandable. That's fine. Even if you take one thing away from the takeaway task, I think that's really good, because it means that you're taking some of the learning from the sessions and thinking about how it impacts you and your learners beyond the session. So that's fine. So in tonight's session, What we're hoping to look at tonight, and we mentioned it a wee bit earlier on, we're going to look at some of the aspects that we've not already looked at in terms of counting. So you'll see on the slide that we have highlighted some of the boxes here. Some of them we've already covered, so we're using one-to-one correspondence. So a lot of the stuff that's highlighted in yellow, we've probably already looked at. But we know, and we've explained this in quite a few of the previous sessions, that counting is really complicated. There's lots to consider before we can make real sound judgments about the effectiveness and the development of counting for our children. We know it's much more than just being able to say a number string and number words in sequence. So you'll see here that the E's and O's are kind of outlined and the benchmarks, are outlined on the slide just now. But there's a lot more to counting, and we're hoping that what we've covered over the 5 sessions gives that indication of how complex it is. So we've covered some of them already. In tonight's session, we'll cover the ones in blue, or we'll try to, but it will just be a kind of overview and a light touch of things that you might want to consider. Again, I've mentioned already we'll also share an evaluation with you towards the end of tonight's session. So just that gives an overview of where we're going in terms of content for tonight's session. And thank you to the people who are commenting to say that the Padlet's really helpful and that the takeaway tasks are useful. That gives a good bit of evidence for Yvonne and I. So let's move on, Yvonne. So, as previously discussed, and we mention this all the time, it's really important that there's a bit of a shared understanding of some of the vocabulary used, and this can be especially important when we're thinking about numeracy and maths. And we know from experience and from research that if we don't challenge some of the misunderstandings and the misconceptions, that these can really develop over time, and it makes it much more difficult and hard to address the further on learners progress in their learning if we don't try and chip away at some of those misunderstandings and misconceptions early on. So what you'll see in the slide just now is just lots of different representations for 8. And as always, that's something that we try to promote, that children are exposed to a variety of representations. And really that's so that they can build up a visual picture in their minds of what 8 is and what it might look like. So for example, is a 4 and a 4. It's also double 4, or it's 2 sets of 4. We could, you could unpick that. There's lots of ways of expressing what that 4 and 4 is and what way we want to explain that. But 8 is also a 5 and a 3. It's 6 and 2 more. But it's also the number of the bus, or it's the amount of claps or bounces of a ball or taps in a drum. So you can see that it then becomes much more than maybe what we initially thought. So let's look a wee bit at some of the language that we might use. And one of the language, one of the words that we might use is number, the number 8. The number is a count. So again, just thinking about that language and that terminology, a number is a count or a value or a measurement, really an idea in our head that quantifies something in our minds. And there are different ways to translate a number, which is kind of your thought of quantity, into its physical form. We write or talk about numbers using numerals such as 8, the digit 8, or in written form, EIGHT. But we could also hold up 8 fingers. We could tap the ground 8 times. We could clap 8 times. These are all different ways of referring to the same number. So essentially, numerals are the words or the symbols that we use to represent our numbers. So the number is the idea, the numeral is how we write it or represent it, and numerals are made up of digits. I'm confusing myself. I'm trying to do this to make it easier, and we'll come to an example soon that I hope will help. So really a numeral is the number written down. The digits are the 10 single symbols, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right up to 9, that we use to represent numerals. So I think we'll move on, and hopefully the example that we're going to show will kind of exemplify that a little bit, and it will help. So let me just quickly recap. A numeral is a symbol or a name that stands for a number. A digit is a single symbol used to make numerals. So digits make up numerals, and numerals stand for that idea of a number in the same way that letters make up words. And words stand for an idea of a thing. So what you'll see here, and we're going to compare it to the breakdown that's illustrated here on the slide just now for the word cat. So the word cat is made up of 3 letters, K-A-T. And when we think of the word cat, we've got lots of ideas about what that cat might be, lots of different representations of cat. Maybe we have a pet cat, or perhaps we think of a popular cartoon character who is a cat, or a character in a book, etc. In a similar way, the numeral 64 is made up of the digits 6 and 4. And when we think of the numeral 64, we might think about a score in a game, or how much money in piggy banks, or the number 64 bus, or a measure of 64 in some respect. So I think this really helped me come up with that idea of what do we really mean when we're referring to digit, numeral and number. I found that comparison easier to link it to the word cat. So I kind of hope it's helping you the way it helped me. But what we know is that the word number and numeral are often used interchangeably. They're sometimes mixed up, and it's okay, because technically a number is a numeral. A numeral is simply an example of how to think about a number. It's more important to think about and to have discussions with your staff, I suppose, and your wider team, to stop that confusion between a number and a digit. So if we think back again to that what you're seeing on the screen just now, and it becomes more important when we're looking at 2 digits. 64 is not the number 6 and 4, it's the digits 6 and 4 represent, so it's that idea that we need to think about. Yvonne, come in and rescue me if I'm making this harder than it should be. Is there anything, Yvonne, you want to add?
No, I think it's just as you're saying, as we begin to go with numbers beyond 10, where they've got the 2 digits, we can all be guilty of saying, oh yeah, 64 is made up of the number 6 and 4, but it's not. It's made up of the digit 6 and 4, and it's made up of the number 60 and 4. So it's just being really clear that we're using digit to correctly identify the single digits. And yeah, as you say, if you muddle up numeral and number, that's not as, that again, that's one that we often fall into as well. But it's just when you're talking about how numbers are made up, thinking about 64 being the digits of 6 and 4, and the numbers of 60 and 4 coming together to make that total amount.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'm seeing somebody putting in the chat that the sound has gone off. I'm hoping that everyone, Diane, you're still on the call. Can you hear? Is sound okay from your perspective?
Yep, it's fine from me, yep.
Oh, that's good. A few other people are coming in again. It's just that idea of maybe leaving, unfortunately, and coming back in again, which is not ideal, but hopefully you'll catch up, because most other people are saying that they can hear. So thank you for that. I think we'll move on, Yvonne, to the next slide. In the next few slides, we're going to be looking at counting on and back, or forwards and backwards. And it's coming to that, I've noticed this where I live, it's coming to that time of year where the children just love to get outside and take the chalk with them. And in this example, the drawn number line can be used effectively to really deepen that understanding and develop number sense. So this is, and again, that's what we've tried to promote during all these sessions. It's really about using the experiences the children are already involved in, or the interest that the children are showing, to naturally develop their thinking a bit forward. And again, questions can be adapted to suit where you think your learners are at, and where their needs are, and where their levels of understanding are. But here we can see how easy it is to develop some of the abstract mathematical language of before and after and between, which can be really difficult for children. It's quite abstract. So some children might be challenged further to consider the notion of counting on and back from different starting positions. And again, that's something that we would promote, but only when it's appropriate. And again, if this was something I was taking forward, I might start with preparing the number line already and drawing it out for the children, but maybe drawing attention to the digits as the children jump and land on, for example, the number 4 or the number 5. And I would then start to progress them on to thinking about them drawing their own number lines. And as they're doing that, you're listening in and observing that, how they can recite those sequences and drawing their own number lines using whatever sequence they've been learning about, whether it's 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. You can actually take that even further and strengthen that even more by the children working together to challenge each other, to question each other and to support one another. So again, it's just that daily opportunity. Now that the weather's really good and the children are out with their chalk, can you use it as a learning opportunity to develop that idea of what comes after, what comes before, what comes between, and just using the children's experiences to develop that understanding. Okay, just moving on. And this is where, again, the children might want to demonstrate their understanding by using what you have modelled for them and draw those lines themselves, or actually work together to do a wee bit of questioning each other and supporting one another. So again, the next slide I wanted to pause just for you to think about, and again, you can come in and put this into the chat. What other opportunities can you think of where the children naturally count on or count back? So I'm just going to pause for a wee second because we've put some examples on the slide just now, just very simple suggestions. I'm going to pause to see if you can think of any kind of natural daily opportunities where the children might want to count on and count back. And don't worry if you can't think of anything. So there, as I said, there's a few examples. Yep, so snacks, a great one. Yep. Or playing darts, amazing. Yep. So you can see from the things that are in the chat and the things that hopefully that are on the slide, it's just about using those daily opportunities where we can just reinforce that understanding. Board games are great. Yep, so thank you, Phoebe. And some of the examples you'll see on the slide just now, some of that has been mentioned, which is great. So that kind of going up and downstairs. And what I really like about the slide, that with the image we've got in the slide there, is what we're showing is the digit and the associated quantity. And I think that takes that step further in terms of the children being able to visualise what could be quite an abstract representation. So again, where we can, we're showing the visual and that quantity alongside it. Playing hopscotch, yep, and again there's an image there that will show that visual representation in the bottom middle image. I think that's quite a nice idea. But just simple things as like labelling things across your setting, like we can see there in the pegs, just to reinforce that process. So it might be the pegs for their jackets, it might be a welly boot station if you keep your welly boots in a station. The snack area, absolutely, people have mentioned that as well. And something as simple as throwing and catching, where the points add up if the children are successfully throwing and catching, but if the ball is dropped, then they need to deduct, so they're doing that counting backwards. Or playing hide and seek, when traditionally when I was playing hide and seek, I would then do the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to 20, but actually why not change that about a little bit and have the children counting back before the hunt begins. So there's wee tweaks that we could make, is essentially what I'm saying here about what we do every day, and that counting backwards using the timer, absolutely. Just subtly, but actually very important that we're getting that in there. So again, big thank you to the people who are sharing. And on the next slide, again, a wee bit of a caveat with this would only come, so we're looking at counting on and back here and we're using 5 or 10 frames, but it is that caveat of only use this at an appropriate time and when you think your children are ready for it. We spoke, if you came along to session 2, we spoke in session 2 when we looked at subotising about the power of noticing, and I've already mentioned it in this session again about that power of noticing and wondering. We really should be dedicating time for our children to notice, but for them to then share and discuss their noticing. So again, you might start off with something like this, with just using a what is the same and what is different. So, you know, using a 10 frame in this case and asking the children not about what they see in terms of the count, but in terms of what do they notice or what do they wonder. And I would use them, or what's the same and what's different, before I moved on to the actual numeracy aspect, because the children will be focused on the see blue, the see red, and we need to get all of that learning and all that conversation out first. And again, some children might just say, I see some blue and I see some red. And again, it's about how we use our questioning to gradually extend and develop that, but absolutely just start off with all the noticing. We would start off introducing these other questions that have just come onto the slide just now gradually as the learner's understanding progresses. So you might again just start off, if you do the what is the same, what is different, by saying, do you see more blue or red? Again, we're not actually asking them to count. We are just really focusing on what they see. The how manyness, if that is even a word that I've just made up, the how manyness is gradually introduced. And again, I've used here a 10 frame. An important thing I think I want to mention at this point is we should remain working with a 5 frame until the children fully develop their understanding of 5 before a 10 frame is introduced. But when we move on to a 10 frame, if we've done all that work on a 5 frame, the children can look at what I've put on the slide just now and see, in this case, an 8 as a 6 and a 2, because they've got that idea, or a 5 and a 3. You know, they can start to see that in different ways. What we're aiming for, of course, is that the children count 6 blue and count on 7, 8 to reach the total of 8 counters, all together made up of 6 blue and 2 red. What we don't want, but we often see, is that when we're asking the children how many altogether, they go back to counting from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but they can't count on from 6 to get to that total of 8. So Yvonne, when Yvonne comes in, we'll talk a wee bit more about how we can develop that. But it's really interesting to observe how closely, you know, how children do the counting. That will really tell us how much they know and how much they understand. But again, we'll pick up on that a wee bit later on. And on the next slide, you might be familiar with these already. So these are numeral tracks. Numeral tracks are lines essentially that are made up of kind of cells, and those cells are normally square or rectangular. And in each cell, there's a number. These can be really helpful when children need to practice that forward and backward counting sequences, but they can also be really helpful for thinking about what the number before and the number after is, which I said earlier on is really quite an abstract and difficult concept for children. We can also use numeral tracks to practice skip counting by writing numbers in a skip counting pattern on the strips instead of sequential numbers. The tracks can also be great to demonstrate the language associated with aspects of numeracy and maths, and you can see a lot of that on the slide together. You'll probably have used these, and again, if you have used them and you're familiar with them, pop that into the chat, because we know there are commercial ones available. What I would say is, why not work with the children to make one or to make a set, depending on where your children are at, and that's what this slide is demonstrating. So we can easily put numeral tracks together with help from the children, and that process and that opportunity would really give you a great time to hear and see how much the children know about that kind of sequence. The numeral track can be used quite successfully in a small group setting. You can make them quite bespoke and appropriate for your individual needs, so it can be easily differentiated. Essentially, you can use different tracks depending on the need. So, for example, one child might be working within a 1 to 5, while another group or another child is working within 1 to 10, or 11 to 20, or a skip counting sequence, or whatever your children are demonstrating understanding in. And to start off with, you can have more of the flaps lifted to give the children that successful starting point. So you might have 1, 2, 3 and 4 showing, for example, and you would do that counting together, 1, 2, 3, 4. And when you get to 4, you might want to ask the children what comes after 4. And again, gradually, you might want to get to the point where you can lift one flap, revealing one digit, and the children can automatically say what comes after. The same process can then be used to practice that counting backwards and naming the number before. So again, it's just that idea of forwards and backwards all the time. The image at the bottom, the middle bottom, shows every second flap lifted, and again, that supports that understanding of skip counting. The digits in the strip are sequential in this case, and every other flap is lifted, as you can see on the slide. You can use them very effectively to practice whatever skip counting pattern or sequence you're currently working on. So it might be 10, 20, 30, etc. But again, as I've explained, maybe start off with several of the flaps lifted and ask the children to count on and build progressively from there. So hopefully that's been helpful. I'm going to pass on to Yvonne just now. Yvonne's going to look at recognising and identifying.
Thank you, Maria. So yes, these are two words, recognising and identifying. They're two skills that we want to encourage children to be able to learn, but sometimes these are words which can be used interchangeably by practitioners, so it's really important to reinforce that when we talk about recognising and when we talk about identifying, it's two different things and two different skills. So if you can imagine that there were some numerals on display and I said, can you point to the number 6? I am asking you to recognise which one out of these is 6. Now, obviously, because this is a PowerPoint, they're a bit like flashcards, but it could be anywhere. It could be on the buses, it could be on the doors, it can be anywhere within your setting. And I think it's important to kind of picture these things within your own setting. Some people here are from early learning and childcare settings. We've got childminders on the call, but we've also got people who are working with more in kind of additional support needs settings, where they're working with children who are right at that early foundation stages of counting. So again, the children that you're working with and kind of how you adapt this to suit best. If I was to hold up something and say, what is this? Then I'm asking you to identify it. And for children, recognising and identifying can develop at different speeds. And I think to adults, it can be quite confusing and sometimes it can be quite frustrating that actually children can seem to recognise the numbers, but actually then they're really struggling to be able to identify it. And this is where I think if we go back to those of you who were with us in our very first session when we looked at the learning French numbers, if we go back to thinking what it's like to learn another language, if I was to lay out these cards and say to you, which is the one that says chien or dog, if you're unsure, then through that sort of process of elimination, you could possibly be able to work out the answer. So by looking at some of these, you might know, for example, that one of them, well, I think that's probably hamster, but what I know, there's one there that's got rouge, that's a colour, so I don't think dog would necessarily be the one that's got the colour in it. So you can begin to knock ones out that are definitely not the card that says dog. And that's you being able to recognise and use your skills to recognise that. Whereas if I just held up a word and said to you, what is this? I'm asking you to be able to identify what that word says. That is difficult because you don't have any other context clues to go with. So you need to be able to really look at that and know exactly what it says. And it's the same when we go back to the example with children. Here, when we're asking them to recognise 6, they might be able to automatically discount, well, I know that's 3 because that was 3 on my birthday, and well, I know that's 0, so I can take that one out. So they can recognise through using clues and that sort of process of elimination, whereas identifying is much harder because I'm just showing them that, and they need to know that independently of anything else to know that that is 3. Past those ones. So there's lots of ways that we can encourage identifying and recognising. And, some of these things are things that you might have planned that kind of come up. So you might be, for example, on a walk in your local area or around the building, and you're encouraging children to identify. So what number is on the bus? What speed do we have to drive at here? And also to recognise, so you're saying to them, who can press number 6 on the keypad, or who can find the door that's got the number 2 on it. So lots of opportunities to build these skills into our everyday routines as well. So things like when children are putting items away, when they're playing with things, so what number of scooter are you on today? Or let's play a game. Can you bring out game number 8 to play? Can you hang your apron up on peg number 2? How much is snack costing today? All these things that you're doing on a daily basis throughout your setting are helping to encourage the identifying and recognising. And there's also lots of different games that can help to reinforce this concept. And again, it's about using your interactions to help scaffold and model. So what number have you landed on the beanbag? Or, oh, you're on number 8 on the board game now. So again, it's kind of using your interactions in that way to help children to kind of model these skills and to help them build up that understanding. The other terms that we kind of hear used quite a lot, and again I think it's important just to kind of clarify these, are what we mean by ordering and sequencing. So a number sequence is a set of numbers that are linked by a rule. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is linked because we are adding 1 each time, or 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 we're adding 2 each time, or 70, 60, 50, 40, we're subtracting 10 each time. That's the sequence of the numbers. And once you've worked out what the rule is, you can work out what the next number in the sequence is going to be. And sequencing is really important because it helps children to build up that understanding of recognising patterns in numbers as they begin to explore things like odd and even numbers, and also as they begin to go on to count. So not just counting in ones all the time, but as they count in 2s and 5s and 10s, they need to be able to understand the sequence of numbers. When we talk about ordering, that is a way of arranging a sequence. So for example, the cards that are on the bottom there, we usually ask people, can you put them in order from the smallest to largest, or largest to smallest, or in ascending or descending order. And you'll notice that not all of the numbers need to be there to be ordered out. So for example, we're missing 3, we're missing out 7, but you're able to still put them into order because you understand the numbers that are missing in the sequence. And again, there's lots of ways that we can encourage this across the things that we do, and helping children to become familiar with these concepts through the routines and the experiences that happen. So it might be that children are encouraged to take things that have been arranged and encouraged to put them back in the right position. So things like some of your outdoor equipment, we've seen things like car parking spots where if they've been riding on number 3, then they put it back into that spot. Things like tubs or baskets, shelves and drawers that are in that sequence of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or whatever it is, and then once children have finished using it, they're encouraged to place it back into the right place. It might also be, we know lots of people have loose parts available, and actually sometimes just adding in digits can encourage children to begin to explore the concepts of ordering and sequencing quite naturally. And so often when you observe what children are doing, you might see that they begin to line the numbers up, or they might begin to, for example, attribute the quantity. So they might take the 3 and lay out 3 shells, they might take the 5 and lay out 5 stones, or whatever your loose parts happen to be. And it's really important that we're kind of encouraging children. Oh, I notice that you've lined them up. How have you lined them up? Oh, I see that you've put all the odd numbers over here. Or, oh, I can see that you're going from 10 all the way down to 0. So it's just, again, that conversation and your interactions about what you're noticing that they are doing, and helping them to kind of think about other ways that they've done it. And, oh, I've lined mine up with all the even numbers over here. And, it kind of sparks their curiosity in exploring different ways of ordering and sequencing numbers. It might also be that in your setting you've got kind of specific puzzles or games or blocks that have got numerals on them, and this is when children are just kind of left to explore them, and they can become familiar with the arrangements. And we spoke in session 3 when we talked about the counting principles, about developing that stable order as they count out loud. And again, you find often quite naturally when children are exploring and playing with these things that they do begin to put them into order themselves, into sequence, and kind of saying them out loud, which helps them. Another thing that's kind of mentioned quite explicitly within the benchmarks is ordinal numbers. And one thing that we would say is that children need to be able to confidently count forwards and backwards in ones before you begin to introduce them to something like ordinal numbers. So when working with ordinal numbers, and that's, you know, when we talk about being first or second or seventh or fifth, that's what we mean by ordinal numbers. They need to be able to connect the number that they know, so a number 1, with vocabulary like first, or the 2 is second. So quite a lot of learning for children to need to link up there, and it's important that we don't introduce this too quickly and kind of end up confusing them. So the ordinal number indicates the position or the order of the collection of things. So for example, you might be first in the race, third in the race, because you're number 3 in that race. Dates are another example of when we use ordinal numbers, because they tell us when something has happened. There's also things that are kind of labelled, so it's the 5th page in the book, or it's the 12th slide in the presentation, that kind of thing. And teaching ordinal numbers, it doesn't have to be complex. It can be linked quite easily to the kind of daily activities, and just again bringing that into your interactions, considering the things that the children do every day. So who's first in the line, who's second to tidy their snack plates away, who's third to come and choose you know, the piece of activity or whatever it is. And again, it's just kind of thinking about ways that you can engage and model that as you go through. And then it begins to kind of move into that more pictorial stage, where actually children don't need to necessarily see the physical things to be able to understand it. So in the example here, when you can see that there is the line, you know, what do they notice? What number is first? Is it the right number? What could we do to sort that out? Is the second number correct? Because again, you can see how children can begin to get muddled up between 2 and that actually second, 2 isn't second. So quite a lot of learning that they need to be able to link up to be able to fully understand what we mean by ordinal numbers. And ordinality refers to the place of the number in the sequence. So lots of things for you to kind of think about as you begin to introduce ordinal numbers with them. So I'm going to pause for a minute, and I want you to have a think about a time that you observed children where they were playing either with numerals or exploring maybe with loose parts, that kind of thing. Did you notice, were they ordering? Were they sequencing? Were they recognising? Were they identifying? So we'll give you just a minute there just to share some ideas in the chat. Did you notice if they were doing any of those things? Thank you. Somebody said an obstacle course. So yep, again, that's a kind of this time of year, it's quite common, isn't it, as they hear older siblings talking about sports days and things like that. So yeah, they might put things out in order. Oh, people talking about the sequence of beads on the necklace. Somebody saying that solving a number puzzle, using the magnetic numbers, that they love to put them into sequence. Lining things up, and yeah, again, it's something that you quite often see, that children will line things up, and then they then begin to make that link between counting them and putting them in, you know, this one, the red one's first and the green one's third, and those kind of things. Lots of ideas coming in there. Maria, I don't know if you've picked up on anything else that was coming in the chat, because it's moving quite fast.
I know it is. I'm trying to like all of them and running out, but I think it's that idea of sharing that variety of ways that we're doing this and thinking about our own context in terms of how can we take some of these skills, so the ordering, the sequencing, the recognising, identifying, and how can we make sure that we're ticking those skills by the experiences that we offer and the activities that our children are really interested in. And we can see from the chat that there are lots and lots of ways of doing that quite subtly in the activities that the children are interested in. So it's great to see and great to get those ideas, because we will share all these ideas on the Padlet. So it's great for people to revisit, and sometimes it just takes one idea to spark some ideas of your own. So no, nothing in particular, but just a point in general, Yvonne, about, you know, using these to take away and think about in terms of your own context.
Thank you very much. So one thing that we kind of often hear is that people they feel that children are secure, that, you know, they're really confident counting, so now it's time to start with addition, and we kind of see it as that kind of right tick counting onto addition. And again, as we're sort of talking tonight, I hope you'll be able to see that it's much more of a kind of building on what children have already learned, and then they'll naturally begin to explore the notion of counting and how that leads on to addition. So kind of looking at how that builds up, imagine that you're playing a child who's playing with blocks. And if you were to say, oh, how many blocks do we have altogether, or something along those lines, depending on where the child is in their mathematical development would depend on the answer that they gave you. And over the next few slides, we're going to explore how children's understanding of counting can continue to develop into their understanding of addition and subtraction. So first of all, and thinking of some of the children that I've worked with, if I was to ask that, I would have some children who wouldn't be able to tell me. They just don't understand the vocabulary that I'm using. They don't understand what all together means, so they wouldn't be able to answer. I would also have children who would tell me that there was 10, or that there was 5, or that there was 3, and actually they're not really being able to work that out. They're just telling me a number that is familiar to them. You know, they're telling me their age or their door number or number 10 because it's their favourite number and that kind of thing. I would also have some children who could make an attempt, but they don't necessarily get the answer right. So for example, they would be counting them, but they wouldn't be saying the words in the right order. So if I said, oh, how many blocks have they got all together? They'd say, oh, 1, 2, 4, 8, 3. There's 3. Or they might start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, but they don't actually know when to stop counting. So they just keep going and going and going. They understand that actually she's wanting me to tell her a number, but I'm not really quite sure what number she's expecting me to say here. So that's that kind of initial stage where actually a lot of these children need to go back in terms of that kind of the counting principles that we spoke about in session 3, in terms of stable order, one-to-one correspondence. Children would very much be working on those kind of aspects. Then as counting skills begin to develop, there would be children who would be able to give the correct answer, but they would need to have the physical concrete objects to be able to touch, to be able to move, and to be able to count. So in this example, if I was to say, oh, how many blocks do we have altogether? The child would touch each of the blocks in turn in order to work out how many there was altogether. And even if I had reinforced it by kind of starting my question as, I've got 3 blocks, how many do we have altogether? The stage that they were at in counting, they would still start counting from 1. So they would go 1, 2, 3, and then keep on counting. You might notice that actually children begin to progress on from needing physical objects. So they might listen to me saying, I've got 3 blocks, how many do we have now? And they would be able to just say 1, 2, 3 and keep on counting, but they're still starting at 1. And really what we're kind of thinking about is the stage that comes next in counting. And this is really when children have reached what we call the counting on stage. So if I was to say, I've got 3 blocks, how many do we have altogether? They can really comfortably picture what I mean when I say I've got 3, and they can count on from it. So they would say 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 altogether. And actually by the final stage, there will be some children where if I said to them, I've got 3 blocks, how many is there altogether? They would be able to say, well, I've got 2, so that's 5 altogether. And that is using what we call a non-count by 1 strategy. And this is where mathematics can get quite complicated in terms of the language that we use. So we hope that by tonight we're sort of breaking down some of these concepts to make them seem kind of less overwhelming to you. Basically, a non-count by one strategy means that they don't count from one all the time. And here are some of the examples of things that children might develop. So they might begin to understand things like doubles. So for example, if they know that 4 and 4 makes 8 and 5 and 5 makes 10, then they might begin to kind of grasp the concept, well, if 4 and 4 is 8, then 4 and 5 must be 9 because 5 and 5 is 10. So they're beginning to see that link between doubling numbers and near doubles. And again, all your subitizing work and your work with your domino patterns and your dice patterns is really laying the foundations for children to be able to begin to spot and recognise those patterns. Another strategy that we often talk about is make 10 facts, and again, different kind of schemes and resources refer to these by different names. Making 10, it's the number bonds to 10, the different ways that 10 can be made. So this is when children can confidently understand that 9 and 1 makes 10, that 4 and 6 makes 10. And again, lots of the things that we've spoken about over the sessions help to embed that understanding, our work with our finger patterns, our work with our 5 and 10 frames. And it's important because once children have mastered this, and not all of you are in the position where you're kind of thinking about what comes much further on, but once children have grasped the make 10 facts, they can then begin to think about make 20 facts, because if you know that 3 and 7 makes 10, well, 13 and 7 makes 20, and 23 and 7 makes 30, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of really building in the foundations of addition and subtraction. And then the other one is the 10 plus patterns. And this is one that I actually think that number blocks have done quite well in kind of showing. So this is when children understand that 10 plus another amount makes a different amount. So for example, 10 and 2 is 12. 10 and 5 is 15. And what I like about the number blocks is you can see that the characters are made up in the teen numbers. So for example, 16 is made up of the 10 character and the 6 character together. 18 is made up of the 10 and the 8 together. So you can kind of see these 10 plus patterns in a really visual way. And again, another thing, another sort of non-count by one strategy which we've picked out today is fact families. And again, you might have heard of these being referred to as linked families, linked facts, but they all mean the same thing. It's basically when children begin to see that there is a link between addition and subtraction. And I think this is something that over time, particularly in primary schools, has changed. We would often hear of people, doing addition for 8 weeks and then doing subtraction for 8 weeks, whereas now these concepts are taught much more interlinked so that children do notice the patterns. And I think that's something that we do quite naturally in early years when we were exploring number and how numbers are made up. We do talk about all of these things, so it's important that that does continue as they get older. So yeah, you can see here if they know that 12 is made up of 7 and 5, they also know that it's made up of 5 and 7. Or they know that if they had 12 and they got rid of 5, they would be left with 7. And all the different ways that you can think about it. So over the next few slides, we're going to think about some of the ways that you can begin to encourage children to move away from counting by one all of the time and begin to understand how their initial counting skills can lead very naturally into early addition and subtraction skills. So firstly, there's a huge range of vocabulary that we use in maths that all means the same thing. So if we talk about the concept of addition, we might ask children, how many teddies are there all together? Or we might say, what's the total amount of teddies that we have? Or we might say, let's add up all the teddies here. We're asking children to do exactly the same thing, but we've used very different vocabulary in each of these examples. And actually we're expecting them to be able to understand that change in vocabulary And so in order for them to understand that, we really need to be, through our interactions, modelling these terms being used in different ways. And it's the same as we begin to think about subtraction. We use words like, oh, let's take some away, or oh, let's remove some of them, or oh, we've got less. And again, we're kind of asking them to understand the same thing when we are using different words. So again, we need to be modelling and reinforcing those. One that we always like to highlight is the word difference. You'll often see difference incorrectly listed on things like maths displays or in books, being linked as a word that's for subtraction only. But actually, if you think about, oh, what is the difference between 10 and 4? You might work that out by subtracting, so starting at 10 and subtracting. But some people would work out the difference between 10 and 4 by adding, so starting at 4 and adding up to get to the 10. So it's important that when we're talking about difference, we're not always reinforcing that it's subtraction, because you can find the difference by adding as well. So again, it's worth, if you've got kind of word displays and things like that, just checking that, because it's something that we often see in published resources and things, that just kind of making people aware, print it out twice and put it on your addition side as well. So just going to pause for a minute and get you to think about ways that you encourage addition and subtraction being used in your setting. See some things coming in. So people are saying maybe voting. So yep, you might add up how many have voted for a particular story choice. Board games, setting the table up for lunchtime. Somebody said that children were sliding Numicon pieces down into the water, and then they were working out how many were all together at the bottom. Adding up the dominoes, yep, and again, that's something that can often occur quite naturally, that children are quite interested in working out how many their domino totals up to.
I'm seeing that idea, Yvonne, as well, that Phoebe's put in there about accidentally making those mistakes, and that could be across the board, making those mistakes to see how tuned in our children are to picking up on those accidental mistakes that we make, just to see, again, if that sparks that discussion about why you've incorrectly given a response, and the children can then justify why it should be, the right answer. So I like doing that myself, and the children love it when you make a mistake.
I see somebody's put like attendance, so yep, if somebody arrives, you're adding one on, or if somebody's going away, you're taking one out. Great, lots of things there. So again, it's really important that we're kind of thinking about these experiences that we're providing, and again, lots of different ways that you can model and bring in addition and subtraction in real and relevant ways. So, we're not talking about taking 3-year-olds out to do an addition worksheet, nothing like that. It's about what are these everyday experiences that are occurring that you can really highlight. And it's great to see a lot of the things you've spoken about in the chat are the ones that we've included. So games, again, that natural curiosity about working out the total, or, going down the ladder and what did you land on, and those kind of things, or how many more do you need to win, and all those kind of natural occurrences that come in. Lots of people saying stories, songs and rhymes. Was lucky enough to be at an event last week with Peter Sawkins in one of the libraries in Edinburgh, and just watching how engaged they were as he was reading to them, and as they were kind of using their fingers to keep track of the things in the stories and to add up how many things it was. Just really nice to be able to see that. And again, it's that kind of through everyday things, through the modelling and discussion, or how many have you got, how many more do you need to fill it up, all those different things that are going on. And again, as people have said, the sort of routines that happen, snack time, counting up how many things are needed, putting things away, taking things off, how many are left once things have been eaten, all those different things that are kind of occurring in your settings every day that can really help to kind of enhance and develop their addition and subtraction. It's also important that as we begin to think about moving away from always needing the physical objects, there are things that we can begin to do to distance that. And again, a lot of this comes from your modelling and your interactions. So it might be things like, oh, I've put 3 scoops in. Can you help me? How many more? So 4, 5, 6. So you're reinforcing that notion of counting on from a number that you've already started at. It might be that you use counting where things are hidden so they actually can't see how many there are. One that children I was working with really liked was the metal bucket. So, let's put the stones in the bucket, and they could listen to the pebbles dropping in, but they couldn't physically see it. And again, children might naturally begin to kind of track the count on their fingers from what they can hear. So, how many pebbles are in the bucket? Oh, there's 6 pebbles in the bucket, right? I'm going to add some more pebbles in. How many pebbles now? So they're really listening and keeping track of that kind of thing. And again, just through that kind of everyday opportunity that's happening where you're using your interactions to model and scaffold things. Oh, so Sasha's put 2 in here. Right, how many are you putting in? Oh, now we've got 3, 4, 5. We've got 5 altogether. So again, you're just reinforcing that notion of not always needing to go back and, how many did Sasha put in, because you know that she put 2 in. So you're modelling counting on from. And again, things like where you've kind of purposely started a count. So, right, I've got 4 apples. How many did we need? Oh, we needed 8. So we've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's our 8 apples. So that children see that you're not always starting to count from 1 all of the time. And then the last thing in terms of kind of helping them to see these relationships and making that connection, Maria already showed you an example like this where the kind of questioning that you use, if you've noticed that they've kind of drawn things out or laid things out, oh, how many have you got? Oh, I see that there's more blue ones. You're beginning to kind of help them to see the different connections, 5 and 5 making 10, 4 and 4 making 8, and 2 more would make the 10 altogether. So that they're beginning to kind of see the pattern of numbers and how they work together. And this, the balls are in something called a cherry diagram, if you think of it as the sort of cherry in the leaves, or you sometimes hear this called as a whole part model. And basically it's when the whole amount is in the top and you can split it into different amounts. So you might take those 6 things and split it into 5 and 1, or 3 and 3, or 4 and 2. And it just helps children understand that that 6 can be split up in lots of different ways, but it still remains as 6. We haven't added any more, we've not taken any away. The total amount is still 6. So again, we've seen examples where these are kind of chalked out, and again, children are just kind of left to explore and get on with kind of finding out these things themselves. And then the final thing, we've included a couple of examples where the addition or subtraction is written slightly differently. So you'll see the ones in the blue, and sometimes children, even in our ELC settings, do begin to, oh, can you write that down for me? They begin to kind of, okay, let's do some adding. They want to actually begin to explore it written down. And so, again, you can take that opportunity to model that it's not always written as a number, and a number is the total. We can say that 12 is made up of 7 and 5, or that 7 is 12, take away 5. So again, we often model that in our language, but we don't necessarily model that so much when we're kind of recording things. And again, that can help to kind of unpick the misconception that children get around what the equal sign means, because when they always see it as something add something equal something, or something take away something equal something, they don't necessarily understand that equals is kind of balancing essentially the 2 sides of the calculation. So important that if you are writing things down, just throw in the odd example where the equal sign is kind of at the beginning like that. And again, it's just that curiosity and that questioning that it brings, which can be kind of fun for children to explore as they get to that stage of that interest of seeing numbers written down more formally. And that's the kind of at the end of the sort of how you begin to introduce the initial addition and subtraction skills. I'm going to hand over to Maria, who's just going to kind of round us off for the final bit of the session tonight.
Thanks, Yvonne. So yes, we're just a couple of slides left, and the next one's just a repeat. I've just put it in the chat there. But people have mentioned to us, and I see in the chat again, that people are really loving the idea of the Padlet, and it's doing what we intended it to do in terms of keeping everything in one place. I've made a note to myself that we can maybe add some additional websites to the Padlet, and Yvonne and I can work on that as we're uploading tonight's presentation and making session 3 available for people. So there'll be some tweaks that will come to the Padlet over the next sort of couple of days and beyond, just to make that really a rich space where you can find almost everything that you need. So we're glad that that's been useful to you. So save the link so that you've got it for future reference. And the next slide is really just, it's our last session tonight in terms of this series, but we didn't want to leave without another takeaway task. You'll be glad that we won't be checking in on this one because we don't have a follow-up session, not this side of the year anyway. But again, we thought it would be quite important for you to revisit some of this concepts that Yvonne and I have been speaking about tonight in terms of thinking about identifying and recognising, or those ordering or sequencing skills that Yvonne spoke about, or about ordinal numbers and where are our opportunities that we can really start to dig in and develop those skills. So again, there's a wee bit of everything in there in terms of the main highlights that Yvonne and I have shared with you tonight. But you'll see that the bottom right one there is about the evaluation. And I did mention earlier on that we would be doing an evaluation tonight because this is the last session, and we're really hoping, I know it says that on the slide, we really do hope that you fill this in, and we've deliberately left time tonight for you to do that, because it really does make a difference to us, and Yvonne and I will look closely at the feedback. We will take the points that you shared with us on board in terms of what might this next series of professional learning sessions that we offer look at. Is there anything that we might have missed? Is there anything that we didn't go over enough? You know, so there's lots and lots of things that we could do, but what we want to do is make sure that it's relevant and meaningful to you. So we're going to stop just now deliberately to give you time to follow the link that's on the chat pane, or indeed use your phone and follow the QR code. And please, it's not onerous. We've tried to keep it quite tight so that it doesn't take you too long, but if you can please take a wee bit of time just now, embrace the silence, which we're not terribly good at, and take time to fill in that evaluation so that Yvonne and I are quite informed in terms of where we take this next. So I'm going to stop talking just now and probably give about, I think, maybe 5 minutes, Yvonne, of just silence, and in that time you can stretch your legs. But if you really would fill that evaluation in for us, it would be extremely welcomed. So I'm going to stop talking and we'll come back together just to say a final thank you in about 5 minutes.